Now we come to the psychology of learning, which is really the beginning of the practice of experimental psychology. So, the educational psychologists were the first to suggest that we could have a truly experimental or a truly scientific psychology, and then the rest is history, as they say. And those psychologists were the behaviorists. So, we're going to see a lot of behavioral psychology in this chapter, even though today I'd say behaviorists make up the minority of contemporary learning theory. So I'm probably going to move pretty quickly through the behaviorism stuff, but talk about how it's set up our practice of experimental psychology, which is very important, and we can't understate its importance. So, what exactly, and here's Adelaide joining me, what exactly is learning? Well, we can define learning as the addition of any new behaviors in familiar contexts or new ways of looking at the world or understanding the world, the acquisition of new problem solving techniques. Um, Pretty much, if we do something different today than we have in the past, the only way to explain that something new is that we've learned it. And so, a lot of learning theory is geared towards trying to understand how that process takes place and then how to initiate it, how to make it happen if we're interested. So, huge implications for the practice of education here. In behavioral learning theory, we focus on, or they focus on, what can be seen. And so a behavior is observable. What I'm doing right now is behaving for you. How did I learn all of the peculiar things I'm doing, or how did I begin to do them? Well, I learned them, and I learned them based on the principles we'll see in behavioral psychology. Of course, there are things that we learn that we can't see, such as the structure of our mind, how we problem solve, how we learn a language. There are processes that are taking place that are not easily seen, but that doesn't mean they aren't happening. In fact, a lot of the complex learning that takes place is outside of view. So in the behaviorist paradigm, which we'll be in for the next, I don't know, 15 slides or so, there's the assumption that we're born almost completely neutral and that anything that we do has been learned. So it can just as easily be unlearned. So if I'm depressed, I wasn't born that way. I must have learned to be depressed. So I can just as easily learn how not to be depressed or learn to be undepressed or happy, I suppose. There are some things, however, that we are born with. Those include reflexes. So if I were to blow in your eye, you're going to blink, and that's just a reflex. You can't change that. You were born that way. It's an evolutionary mechanism that helps protect our eyes. And there are a whole bunch of different reflexes. There are also instincts, and again, instincts are evolutionarily learned, or evolutionary adaptations. And a common instinct is for mothers to care for their young, to appreciate, to love their young, um, to find their young beautiful. And if all those things didn't happen, it would be very hard to take care of and protect our young. So we have this instinct to do it. There's also a very strong instinct to have sex. And so you can see that down there. That's another evolutionary instinct. So I've defined this already. Learning is a, quote, a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. So it can involve conscious and unconscious processes. We'll look at primarily unconscious processes in this chapter, but then we'll get to some conscious ones later. There are two main ways that we learn according to behaviorists, and we'll go through those beginning with classical conditioning. So the man who gets credited with the first classical conditioning experiment is this bearded man, this old bearded man, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. And the big study that he did wasn't about learning at all. He was studying digestion in dogs, and part of that was feeding them and measuring what sort of, how much saliva they produced and what it comprised. So they were looking at the chemicals. I think he was looking at the chemicals present in the saliva. But during the course of his study, he realized that the dog started like preparing to eat before there was any food. It was almost like the dog could anticipate it. My dogs do the same thing. We feed them at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., breakfast and lunch. And at 7 p.m., or thereabouts, my dogs both start looking at me expectantly. And I think they've learned to associate the darkening skies, so like the sun beginning to set, with dinner time. Because during daylight savings time, if the sun is still high, but it's technically 7 p.m., they're not looking at me. It's only once the sun starts going down, now they're looking at me. They've learned to associate that. And so something in the environment changes. And if that change is consistently paired with an effect, what would it be, an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that causes a behavior such as me presenting my dogs with food, eventually my dogs will start to have the same behavioral response to this originally neutral stimulus like the sun going down. So they've learned to associate beginning darkness with dinner time. So this is all called classical conditioning. So let's hear, this is an example of feeding a cat. So we see this is a higher order conditioning. The cat is conditioned to salivate when it hears the electric can opener, the squeaky cabinet door. Okay. Um, so my dogs naturally, so they don't need to be conditioned to salivate when they smell food. If I give them fresh salmon, they're both going to start like salivating and they'll eat it. If I do that every day for a month, they're going to start to associate things that I'm doing uh, with being fed that salmon. So maybe I go to the refrigerator and I'm opening up the refrigerator door, and they hear me open up like the salmon container, or they like undo the um, like unzip the salmon little bag or whatever, and they the Ziploc bag, and they hear that and they go, oh, it must be salmon time. And then eventually they don't even need to hear the unzipping of the Ziploc. They just hear me opening up the refrigerator. And so these are higher order conditioning. We're getting several steps removed from the actual presentation of salmon, but it's happened the same way so many times that pretty soon they know, okay, it's almost time to eat. My dogs also know, like when I put my hat on and my shoes on, it's time to go for a W. I can't even say the word because then their ears are going to perk up and they'll be ready. So we'll go hit a trail and they'll get some exercise. I'm using synonyms here so I don't freak out my dog over here. Um, so even like going to the door would indicate it's time to exercise, but just putting on shoes is a second order step. I haven't even reached the door yet, but they're already seeing it happening. They're anticipating it. So all this is all classical conditioning, and there are a whole bunch of steps for how it occurs, how long it takes for it to become extinct. So extinction is what happens when the uh, unconditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the conditioned stimulus. So um, in the salmon example, if I go to the fridge, I open it up and I unzip salmon and I just eat it myself. I cook it and eat it myself, and they don't get any. After like a month of that, they're gonna stop like getting excited by hearing that noise. The learning that happened, that classical conditioning, will become extinct. And so we can see the strength of the new conditioned stimulus goes up over time. So it goes up a lot at first and eventually kind of peters out or levels out. And then after a period of no more reinforcement or no more pairing of the unconditioned and conditioned stimuli, it starts to become extinct. So there's no longer a behavioral response to that neutral stimulus. And then, kind of randomly, there will be periods where the behavior returns spontaneously. It's called spontaneous recovery. You can read all about the details in the textbook. Um, Thinking about getting ready to go for a walk. She's still sleeping. She didn't hear me say that. What happens if I put sandals on? Will they still think it's time for a walk? I put sandals on and a headband. Will they think it's time to go for a walk? Um, if they do, then they are generalizing between my shoes and my hat. They're generalizing that to like sandals and a headband. But probably they'll know exactly what I'm wearing when it's time for a walk versus what I'm wearing when I'm going to go for a run by myself or do yard work outside. So they learn to discriminate between some of the stimuli. So they only get excited about me wearing a certain type of clothes. Um, to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change, um, I might get up and get dressed every day, like I do. And since it happens so regularly, my dogs aren't going to get excited. It's only those unique times when I go back to my closet and get changed that they're like, uh-oh, is it time? But in the morning, I'm always getting up and I'm getting dressed. So it isn't getting dressed that has them getting excited about going for a walk. It's only when I return, the specific context of when I return to the closet and then get changed and put my running or my walking shoes on, my hiking shoes on. So it's pretty surprising how much discrimination goes on. So discriminating means to recognize one stimulus is important and other stimuli is irrelevant. John Watson learned about Pavlov's study, and he had this radical proposal that he could teach, if you gave him like 10 infants um, that were healthy, he could teach them to become anything he wanted them to become using this principle of classical conditioning, become like a painter, a musician, or even like a grand car thief or something like that. He could condition them to do these things. And part of the way he proved this process was through this study with little Albert. So little Albert is this infant right here, and this is a man with a Santa mask on. And this is actually taken from, I believe, the publication. And so Albert was not afraid of fire. He was not afraid of a dog. These are things that we think are instinctual fears, but we're not born with these fears. And he taught little Albert to become afraid of these things by whenever he was presented with, oh, and by the way, this is little Albert's caretaker or his mom right there. Um, Whenever Albert was presented with fire, they like beat a pipe against another pipe, a really loud noise, and he like had a startle response. And pretty soon he associated the fire with this startle response because they were always paired together to the point where they could just show the fire and he got scared. They did the same with little mouse, and the white fur on the mouse was generalized to like this Santa. And so the idea was this poor baby is afraid even of Santa, but look how close that creepy man is to this boy, this infant. Anyway, they repeatedly uh, tortured this boy and taught him all of these awful fears. And Watson said, look, I've taught him to have these fears. I can teach him anything. Uh, but beyond like reflexes, like crying and falling over, um, Watson didn't really do a whole lot more than that. So it took one of his students, Burris Frederick Skinner, B.F. Skinner, to really take the science of behaviorism to the next level. And so rather than manipulating what comes before a behavior, so like presenting food causes salivation, and then pairing the food with some neutral stimulus causes the neutral stimulus to be tied to the behavior. That's classical conditioning. Skinner focused on what comes after a behavior, which is um, punishment and reinforcement. So if I do something, let's say I record a video with a microphone and I get better interaction, engagement, and feedback, then I'm more likely to continue making videos using a microphone and holding it all awkwardly like this, um, even though it's uncomfortable for me to do. So it's the subsequent feedback I get about something that increases or decreases the behavior. Skinner maintained and demonstrated in his experiments that the behaviors that we do are not all reflexes or are very rarely reflexes. They've been learned based on how those consequences of the behaviors played out. So operant conditioning is focused on the consequences. When you behave in a classroom, the way what you choose to do and choose not to do is based on what you were punished for doing, which you've stopped doing in the classroom, and what you've been reinforced for doing or what you were rewarded for doing. And that stuff you keep doing. So we've got reinforcement, This is something that increases a behavior, and then punishment, something that decreases a behavior. Now, there's two adjectives that famously trip people up, and this goes for PhD psychologists as well as undergraduate students. Positive reinforcement and positive punishment means that something is being added. Negative means something is taken away. So positive plus, negative minus. So positive reinforcement means that I'm giving you something that will increase your behavior. In the college classroom, it might be bonus points. You did a good job answering that question. You have 10 bonus points. I've given you something that's going to increase your question answering behavior. Um, Positive punishment is not an oxymoron. It means I'm giving you something that will decrease your behavior. So if you're in the classroom and you talk, maybe you cut another student off, or you're critical of another student, you're mean or rude to them, and if I'm really shocked by that, I might announce my surprise and my distaste of what just happened. And so I gave them something that would be uncomfortable for them that they wouldn't like, and it would likely decrease the behavior that preceded it. So I've given them something, but that something made the behavior decrease. So positive punishment isn't a good thing. It's I'm giving you something that makes you decrease a behavior. Um, just like negative reinforcement isn't bad, it means I'm taking something away that's going to increase your behavior. So in class, I might take away the final exam. You don't have to take the final exam because your grade, because you did so well in this activity. Congratulations. So I've taken something from you and it has increased your behavior. So you'll probably have to come up with lots of examples over a period of, let's say, an hour before those adjectives really settle in. Otherwise, you're going to assume that positive or negative reinforcement means punishment, but that's not true. Reinforcement is always good, punishment is always bad. Reinforcement always increases behavior, punishment always decreases. This is a table comparing classical and operant conditioning, but the easiest way to think about this is classical conditioning focuses on we'll go here, what precedes a behavior, then we have the behavior, and then operant conditioning focuses on what follows a behavior. So classical conditioning is antecedent, behavior is what you do, and then consequence, that's the operant conditioning. Skinner did a lot of experiments with animals, pigeons, rats, dogs, mice, because they were, I guess, safer and less. There were less ethical hurdles of working with and doing experiments on animals than it would be to do them with humans. Although he reportedly kept one of his children in a box, such as this one, to condition them to behave in, I guess, ways that he was pleased with. Um, the Skinner box was just a way of controlling behavior, so there's a limited number of things that a rat can do in a Skinner box. Once the rat performs some target behavior, like it lifts its arm or like it bobs its head 3 times, it's given a pellet of food. And the pellet of food is reinforcing because he starves these rats until they are 60% of their normal body weight. So it's ravenously hungry. It'll do anything for food. And so it just does a bunch of random behaviors. And once it does the behavior that Skinner wants it to do, or approximation of that behavior, Skinner feeds it. So it goes, oh, yes. And so it keeps doing that behavior over and over again, and then accentuating it into exactly what Skinner wants it to do. So you could ask this rodent essentially to turn around 3 times and then stand up and then clap its hands. And in about an hour of just waiting for it to start to turn, feeds it, turns a little bit more, feeds it, then it waits until it turns a full revolution, then it feeds it, then he waits for it to rotate a revolution and a little bit more, and then he feeds it. And so it keeps repeating this behavior and then adding random stuff to it until it does exactly what he wanted it to do, which he is shaped by the presentation of a reinforcing stimulus, which would be food. Here are some examples, but it's very difficult examples of reinforcement and punishment. Oh, this is a good example of negative reinforcement. In newer vehicles, if you turn them on without turning your seatbelt on, it'll beep at you, and will beep until you buckle your seatbelt. And so the only way to get it to stop is to buckle your seatbelt. So it's negative, something gets taken away, but it's something that you didn't want to begin with. So it increases the seatbelt buckling behavior. Um, but it's very difficult to anticipate what will be reinforcing. So $5 to a 5-year-old will probably be reinforcing, but to a 30-year-old, probably not. You need to make it $20 or $80 or $100. And then now, as like a college professor, if someone wants to get me to do a committee or be involved in something and offers me like several $100, it's not enough to move the needle. I'd rather do nothing than that. And so the reinforcement is important to understand for um, or picking a stimulus that's sufficiently reinforcing is essential in order for operant conditioning to work. So you have to get something that the person cares about or that the animal cares about. Ditto with punishment. Um, Evidently, putting people in prison isn't a very good punisher for whatever it was they did because recidivism rates, is that right? Um, Rates of people who were released from prison going back to prison uh, is pretty high, or they're pretty high. So evidently, taking away someone's freedom isn't very effective. And actually, punishment, Skinner realized later in his career, isn't a very effective way of conditioning a person. So punishment should be de-emphasized, and reinforcement should be emphasized if you're doing an operant conditioning protocol. Operant conditioning is also called shaping. Um, it says shaping is a tool used in operant conditioning, but I would say that it's essentially the process of operant conditioning. So take a look at that. And primary and secondary reinforcers. You might wonder what money actually is, whether it's primary. We think we want money, but really we want what money can buy. Therefore, money is a secondary reinforcer. How quickly reinforcement follows a behavior is important. How frequently reinforcement follows a behavior is important. And we actually think that, or we actually know that a variable reinforcement schedule is the best way to have a consistent behavior developed. If I always give you $5 for meeting me um, in the morning for coffee, and then for like a week, you might think, all right, $5. But if I forget one day, you're like, oh, it's not working anymore. And then the uh, the learning will become extinguished or become extinct. So if I give you $5 like randomly, like maybe once or twice a week, maybe, then I could go like 3 weeks without giving you any money. And you'd think, all right, well, next time you'll probably pay me. So you'll keep going. Um, so continuous reinforcement has the quickest training ability, but it becomes extinguished very quickly. So there we've got the variable. And so you can look at how effective different reinforcement schedules are. If you ever want to go into this and develop these behavioral management schedules for people, you're going to want to know the science behind it. And so it's been studied for about a century now. Operant conditioning has helped us understand things like alcoholism, addictions, and gambling in particular. So we know mathematically that gambling is a bad idea. It's very unlikely that we will win. So how come people become so addicted to it? Well, um, if you're playing the slots and you're more likely to lose than win, excuse me, you're more likely to lose than you are to win. Once you do win, it's like, yes, I won. That feels so good. And you pull a couple more times and you lose in each of those. But if you if you won every 3 times, so you pulled twice and those are duds, and then you pull a third time and you win, you'll know that every third pull is going to be a win. Once you do 4 consecutive pulls without any win, you'll think, all right, this machine is broken. But if it's unpredictable when it's going to happen, that's a variable reinforcement schedule, and now you're going to be hooked for a long time because we just saw in the reinforcement schedules that the variable reinforcement is the strongest in terms of it takes a long time for that to become extinct. You would have to pull it like 100 times without winning in order for that learning to disappear or to fade away. that operant conditioning to fade. So that's why gambling can be so addictive, and it can the strength of that addiction can be so strong. All right, so we've got just a little bit of work here on cognition, and so cognition is what psychologists call thinking, and of course, so much of learning takes place in the mind, and we can't describe it using the principles of behaviorism because we can't see it. So we know that actually from behaviorist experiments where mice and rats did things that we couldn't have anticipated based on the rules of behaviorism, we knew that there was more going on. Um, Actually, there was a pretty famous study of these rats that were put into a maze, and you put them in one time, and it takes them a long time to get to the end. And then you put them in again, and each time you put them in, they get to the end faster. And so it's like for behavior, from the behavior standpoint, they've learned right turn, left turn, right turn, skip, right turn, left turn, done, like that sort of thing. So it's not like they don't understand what they're doing. They've just this behavior has been shaped over a period of trials. But actually, Edward Tolman um, discovered that mice have like a mental image of their um, of the maze. They know exactly where the cheese is and the quickest way to get there. They don't know right turn, left turn, left turn. They know I need to go like 20 paces that direction and that's where the food is, but I've got to go through this ridiculous maze in order to get there. That mice like chewed their way out of the container and went and then chewed their way into where the cheese was. They were able to like remember where it was even if like the cheese was removed, so they weren't smelling it, they just knew um, what the framework was. They could, after doing it so many times, they had like a visualization or an intuitive sense of where they were going. So there's more than just behavior that's happening. Um, in I forget whose experiment, but they were doing a behavioral experiment on monkeys, and uh, they noticed that monkeys started mimicking what the experimenters were doing on break. And so, for example, picking up a bottle of water, an experimenter took a sip of water and set it down and left, and then like the camera was still rolling, and then the monkey did the same thing. And so we can learn quite a bit about what to do even when we haven't experienced the punishment and reinforcement ourselves. So we can watch something happen, and then we know now from neuroscience that our primary motor cortex, which controls our body, is active when we watch somebody do a task, like do a front flip. The parts of my brain that are involved in such a movement are active when I'm watching someone else do it. So I can watch something happen, and it's almost like I'm doing it myself. The same kind of synapses fire, the same brain regions activate. And so part of learning a difficult skill might involve watching someone do it first. And it's almost like trying it out yourself. And then you can practice what it feels like to do it. But the neural connections have already been primed simply by watching somebody do it. Okay, we only got a couple more left. Let's see, social learning theory. We're getting away from cognition and now getting into what it means to be part of a society or a social group. So this is Albert Bandura. He believed that observational learning involved more than just imitation, that there was a mental state involved. And so he argues that we need to focus on it. So it can't just be like something that we're absently watching. We need to be engaged in it. We need to be able to like repeat it in our mind. So there needs to be some sort of retention. We need to be able to practice it. And then tying this all together, we need to want to do it. So I said earlier, I can watch someone do a front flip, and then there's activity going on in my primary motor cortex. But that doesn't mean I'm going to want to do it myself. I'd have to have some reason for wanting to do it because it kind of scares me to do a front flip. Even if like I have the physiology to do it, doesn't mean I'm going to want to. Um, and then even if I want to, it doesn't mean I can. So I would need to practice it. So there are all of that. I think makes intuitive sense. Vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. This just means that if you see someone do something and get punished for it, you're not likely to do it. So someone tells a joke and then they get punished for telling the joke. It's like, ooh, I don't need to tell a joke to know not to do it. I can watch someone else do it. Or maybe I watch them tell a joke and everyone laughs, and then I think, oh, well, I should tell a joke. Maybe people will laugh at me too. Um, I'm not sure exactly how applicable this will be widely, but the Bobo doll experiment showed that children who are have normal behavior, normal moods and affects, if they watch another child behave angrily, they'll behave angrily too. So in this example, children watched other children behave through like a one-way mirror, so the ones behaving couldn't be seen. And so um, they were introduced to this one of those dolls that you push over and it stands back up, like an inflatable doll. And they'd never seen this doll before. But if what they just watched happen, this child interacted with the doll by beating on it, then the child who watched it happen is more likely to interact with the doll the same way. So we can learn how to behave by watching other people. And of course, we know this. If you're in a new classroom and maybe you're a new school and you don't know how they talk or what people consider funny or smart, you're just going to watch. You're going to listen. You're going to try to pay attention and see if you can't understand what qualifies as good behavior and bad behavior. The same is true online. So there are different online communities, and each community is unique. And what is considered acceptable for the community is going to vary. So you have to watch how the community interacts with the people of the community interact with each other in order to get a sense of how you need to participate in that community. And I think Gen Z people are very good at this because they've exposed themselves to lots of online communities from a very young age. They've learned this process and maybe don't have a language for it, but it's definitely happening. All right, this was a question from when I was in high school. Do video games make us violent? Um, it says here, so if I play a video game where I'm like shooting people, is that going to make me want to shoot people? I don't know what the consensus is. It's been studied so much, and I haven't seen like compelling evidence that it does make people violent. It says here that there's a correlation between watching violence and subsequent aggression in children, but because it's a correlation, we don't know if maybe aggressive people like playing violent video games, and therefore it's a self-selection issue. So if we took someone who wasn't aggressive and asked them to play violent video games, maybe they wouldn't find them interesting. So it could be that violent people play violent video games, or that violent video games cause people to become violent. So that has to do with methodology, which we don't go into very much in this class or in like a general psychology topic. Um, so as you can see, like that sort of topic would be involved within learning or the psychology of learning. And again, looking at the psychology of learning broadly, a lot of behaviorism, very little cognitive psychology. But today, if you were to study learning, chances are you would adopt a cognitive or neurocognitive framework, not a behaviorist one.